Tonight's first guest is Jordon Moses. Jordon and his wife are owners of Blackbird Revolt, a branding and media design company. Jordon was also most recently a member of the Clayton Jackson McGhie Memorial Committee, but has since resigned his involvement with that organization. Thank you for being here tonight, Jordon. Please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, thanks for having me. So I came to Duluth about 11 years ago, almost 11 years ago this August, as a student studying sociology at the University of Minnesota Duluth. Through my education there, I got really involved in community while I was a student. One of my professors and mentors, who has since passed, John Arthur, actually introduced me to the story in the history of the lynchings in Duluth. He asked if I would read the book overnight and report to the class the next day. And so I went to the library on campus and I read the book overnight, and I came back to talk about it in class the next day. The class that I was in was Race, Crime, and Justice, and so we were talking about how the history of those lynchings relate to the modern context of policing and our criminal justice system. And so ever since then, I've been pretty involved. I was once a board member. I've attended many of their events, and then most recently I was their event organizer for the commemoration. I also own a business, like you said, Blackbird Revolt, with my wife, and we do graphic design, specifically centered around social justice and using design to raise awareness, to educate, to challenge.
So how does design help promote social and racial justice? How can you work that in?
For sure. One of the things that we know is art is a part of who we are across the globe. Art and design have always been part of every single movement. If you look at political campaigns, I mean, they're branded, they're designed, and politics affects our lives. You look at the civil rights movement, there are symbols associated with that, whether it's buttons or, different organizations like SNCC or, SCLC. You look at the Black Power movement and the Fist and the Black Panthers. So art and design is always a part of movement work. It can help educate, it can help network and brand, it can help inspire and motivate, and it can also help folks rally behind messages and ideas.
You know, you mentioned a little bit about talking about yourself, about reading about the lynching in a class. So what were your thoughts about that, reading that book? And
yeah, I was, I wouldn't say I was shocked, just because I was aware that the history and the legacies of lynchings were something that are common across the country. However, I was a little disappointed that I had made it a year and a half, 2 years into my education at the university, and I hadn't heard about this yet. Something so atrocious and something that really has shaped our community and been part of this community's history, I figured would be something that folks would be talking about and working to reconcile. And so I think I was more disappointed as I read through, and that was when I immediately began to do more research and found out about the organization that act as stewards of the memorial and the history.
so is that what got you involved with the memorial?
Yes. After I read that book, I actually submitted an application to join the board, and I joined the board when I was 20 years old.
So what were your thoughts then on what the work Clayton Jackson McGhie Memorial is doing? How is that going? Or, I know you're not involved now, but how was it in the past?
Yeah, I think the organization has done some really important work and in building the memorial and making sure the memorial is taken care of, making sure they're acting as stewards of the memorial. I think that memorial is an important piece. They've also done some work with providing scholarships and driver's education grants. These are really important things, and so I think those are all good pieces that the organization has worked on in our community, and important initiatives that they've worked on.
So what was your reason for resigning from the committee?
There were differences in the direction of the organization. I shared a different vision than that of the board of directors, and so it just made sense that they carry on their vision and I do the work elsewhere.
So what are your plans then? You're going to move?
Yes, yes. So I actually will be moving. That was a decision that my partner and I made more recently. After 11 years here, I feel that it's time for me to try something else and navigate a different community and see what I can learn and add to a different community. And so we'll be leaving this summer in August. Yeah.
Getting back to the Clayton Jackson McGhie Memorial and reading about the lynching, what can you tell us about who Max Mason is?
For sure. So Max Mason was one of the gentlemen that was actually arrested while or after the lynchings were happening in Duluth. The chief of police and I think it was the second in command or some other representative went with the chief of police up to Virginia to arrest more men because they weren't sure if they got the folks that they wanted to pin this crime on. And so they brought Max Mason back to Duluth, and ultimately he went through trial. The evidence was very weak. The county attorney at the time said it was weak. The judge said the evidence was weak. I believe it was the county attorney that said, I have no doubt in my mind that if he was a white man, there wouldn't be a conviction. And so Max Mason ultimately was convicted. I believe he spent 4 years in prison before being released under the condition that he couldn't return to the state. And so Max Mason is another victim besides just the 3 men that were lynched.
So why did you take up the cause to exonerate Max's name?
So that was something that we talked about as a committee, as a 2020 commemoration committee, in tandem with our partners. We were working with a legal coalition of lawyers and other legal representatives, and that was an idea that came up pretty early. It was something that was important to us because we felt that our state, our county, our city hadn't really done some of the formal work necessary to begin healing and reconciliation around this history. And a pardon is one way to do that. A pardon is one way to cement it into law, into history, that there was a mistake made. This person shouldn't have been convicted. This person shouldn't have been arrested. This person shouldn't have been charged. And so the best we can do for Max Mason is posthumously pardon him.
So were you, where does that stand right now then?
So the Pardons Board actually meets tomorrow, and I believe Max Mason's case will be the first one heard in the morning, and I believe that's right at 9 a.m. And so the Pardons Board will vote on the pardon, and we'll see how that turns out. We won't know till tomorrow. We feel optimistic about it, but that's where that process is at.
So that was really a cause that you took up on by yourself to take up.
Yeah, I wouldn't say by myself,
Okay.
but the 2020 committee and the legal coalition pushed this, and they were really supportive. We couldn't have done it without our legal coalition being able to ask questions because a posthumous pardon hasn't been done before, and so looking into legal precedents around the country to see if it's something that can be done, if law allows it or prohibits it, and so that was really helpful. The lawyers were really great about that and putting together the petition and really adding the context and the content for making sure that we had a strong application.
So what were your thoughts then when you saw the video of George Floyd being restrained?
The first thought that came to my mind was, again, I think it's a cycle. It's a pretty regular thing that happens in this country. I think folks who have access to media are pretty well aware that this is an issue. Folks might feel differently about what is at the root of those issues, but I think folks are pretty well aware that this is an issue. And so I just said again, and I remember seeing it early in the morning and then going to sleep and then waking up again and seeing it grow and grow and grow and grow and grow. And so, from that point on, I said, okay, it's time to process this. It's time to reach out, especially since it is close to home. Some of my best friends and family, live in those neighborhoods. They live in the Twin Cities. And so, how can I support from Duluth? And then how can I also do work in Duluth so that we can build a community in which that couldn't happen here?
What about the the ensuing protests after that?
Yeah. I was, I figured those would happen. Those are sort of, that's kind of what typically happens. It's the organic nature of this work and this reality. I will say I was definitely energized by many of the organizers and artists and community members in Minneapolis engaging in these protests in ways that I haven't seen before, I haven't seen in a long time. And utilizing art, utilizing mutual aid networks, and finding ways to support community through this process and really acknowledge this to a level that I haven't seen in my lifetime.
So how do we move forward then?
I think the biggest thing is mass systemic and cultural change. We live in this country where racism is rampant. Racism is built into the core of many of the systems that we all live within and operate in. It's so well built in that most folks don't understand or see what is really at play and why these realities are the way that they are. And so for us, as communities, as cities, as counties, as states, as a country, we need to figure out how we vastly overhaul and deconstruct and defund and dismantle the things that perpetuate and create these issues. And we actually need to redistribute power and resources to communities so that communities can have our own self-determination, so that we can shape spaces and neighborhoods where we can all truly be safe and truly thrive and have opportunity and equity and peace and safety and justice.
Jordon, I feel like we've just barely even touched the surface of this issue. I just want to thank you for coming on tonight, and thank you for the words.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.